And then there's compositional like techniques that help with leading the audience to look at something, right? But overall, the idea of composing an image properly is making sure that what you want the viewer to look at or see is clearly in the image, and there is little to no distraction that's taking away the audience's eye from that particular subject.
Yeah.
Right? So composing, one is framing. Framing is not the only thing that's involved in composing.
Okay,
Right?
tell me more.
So we'll probably even go as deep as set design is a part of composition.
I got you.
Right?
I got you.
But then you'll have the basic techniques is obviously rule of thirds. That's one of the simplest techniques. Is think of the frame. If we're doing like a 16:9 aspect ratio, think of the frame split in 3 vertically and then split in 3 horizontally.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
And you can either have them dead center.
Yeah.
Or you can have them on one of those thirds.
Yeah.
Right. And that I tend to like using one of the thirds if I'm doing like a sit down interview or something like that with a person. Well, you can only interview people, right?
Well, I mean, I've never tried interviewing animals before,
Never
but
tried
you know,
interviewing a bird.
maybe that's something we could try at some point in time.
Right.
Interview some animals and see what
I'm
happens.
sure there are people doing that right
Yeah.
now as we speak. But yeah, if I'm doing an interview, I like to put someone on one of the thirds, left or right third.
Yeah.
But if you're doing that, you want to make sure if you're putting them on one of the thirds, you want to make sure that you're intentional about which side of which direction they're looking. For example, we're sort of on the third, right? Not completely, but sort of on the third for what we're doing.
Yeah.
We'd probably bring it a little closer in if we're doing the lower third, the rule of third thing. But in essence, what you want to do is have that person looking towards a direction. So, for example, if I were the one being interviewed, I would want to be looking towards the side of the frame where I have the most space.
Right.
Right. It'd be weird if you were on that third and looking that way.
Right.
It's a thing.
For sure.
It's a creative. Like you can actually do it, but it has to be an intentional, creative choice. Outside of that, you don't want the person's back to be where like 2/3 of the frame is.
Yeah.
You want them to facing the 2/3 that have space.
Yeah. So for our audio listeners, if you guys decide that you want to sit down and listen to this, if you can imagine a frame with 2 vertical lines splitting it into 3 thirds and 2 horizontal lines creating a little grid, you can think of the points in those
the points where those lines meet.
right. You want to position your subject
Somewhere in that towards
Right.
that point, especially if it's like a face. If it's
Right.
just like, let's say, a shoulder up
Yeah.
shot, usually you'd want one of their eyes to be hitting one of those points, one of those, right,
where it crosses.
right?
Yeah. I agree with you. I don't know why, but somehow it's very pleasing to have more space in front of someone when they're looking off, especially for an interview.
Because that's kind of part of it is part of it psychological. It's like if they're looking towards a direction where there's space, you in your mind you're like, just outside of that frame is the person they're talking to.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Right. So
okay.
it's like if that extra space was behind them,
It feels uncomfortable.
it feels uncomfortable.
cramped.
It feels cramped, and
Yeah.
it feels somewhat uncanny.
Yeah.
Right. And again, that can be a creative choice for
sure.
a purpose.
For sure.
Right.
If you want to create a
If you want to create some uncomfortable feelings,
for sure,
that's-
you have that framing all the way up
Yep.
there.
So that's one of the techniques regarding composition.
Rule of thirds, and why we use it is usually to create balance, maybe to have a subject placed in the frame to create some balance. Where outside of interviews, where would you use something like this for, like
Product photography, product videography. Like for example, if I'm doing, I can just see a lot of different designs where I'm framing a product on one of the thirds.
Yeah.
A lot of things are done dead center, which is fine. So it's
Yeah.
also a look. Interviews, talking head stuff.
I get the
is
impression
also a
you
look.
don't like that.
No, it's not I don't like it. It's not my default choice.
Okay.
Right.
Too
'Cause
flat, too boring.
yeah, it's too boring, and it's sometimes it depends on like budget, set, like
Yeah.
what the set looks like, the amount of lights that is needed to make it look good. And but most of the time for me is like if I can get them on a third, and the space looks good and there's not like dead white walls or whatever it is,
Yeah.
then I will try to put them on a third. But if they're looking directly to camera, most of the times it's usually better to be center.
Yeah.
Right, or mostly center. It doesn't have to be dead center. It could be centered slightly off to one side. But I prefer, if I'm doing an interview, for example, 2 camera interview, a lot of the times I'm putting them on one of the thirds.
Yeah. Tell us about leading lines.
Leading lines is one of the other basic cinematography, videography techniques. In essence, it's where if there are lines in your frame, you want those lines to be leading towards the subject.
Yeah. So it's
Right.
usually to bring someone's eye
Yeah, because
to a-
visually,
yeah.
in your eyes are almost perceiving those lines like arrows
Yeah.
pointing towards the subject, right? So in a lot of cases, it's like if you have walls or if you have, let's say like buildings, and there's buildings are mostly square,
Yeah.
or rectangle,
Yeah.
right? So there's lines on the windows, there's lines on fences, there's lines on walls, and if you can get those lines to be leading towards the subject, then your eyes are visually drawn
Yeah.
to that one.
Where would you use this most in your line?
Again, in interviews, I mean, mostly I'm doing corporate shoots, corporate interviews.
For sure.
And one of the easiest ways I have found to kind of use the leading line principle is putting someone in a corner of a room, right? Usually there's furniture in the back, and furniture again tends to be mostly square or straight lines, right? So there's some straight lines in the image. Sometimes the patterns on walls or the patterns that come with like a big old window, like a big window tends to have frames, right? So there's lines in that, and so putting them in a corner tends to have furniture, the lines on the furniture and the lines on the windows leading towards them,
Yeah.
right? And then sometimes it's intentional, where you find ways to put lines in the frame that lead to the
To the subject.
to the subject.
Yeah.
That's usually you're most likely going to see that in like commercials or films where people have big budgets for a set design, right? Mostly for us in corporate cinematography, we kind of just get a space that we have to
Yeah.
use.
And you kind of just say, oh, this kind of looks like it would.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And so you kind of have to use the space that you get, but try to make the space work. in the best way.
Hopefully you guys are following at home. Hopefully you guys are making notes on these things, and then you go out into the world and make stuff. So the next thing we're moving on to is headroom or nose room. We touched a little bit on the nose room when it comes to putting subjects on that grid that we mentioned earlier on. But headroom, can you tell us about what headroom is?
Again, the basic rule of thumb, and again, these are guidelines, and
Yeah.
these are sort of best practices, but they're not hard and fast rules. All right, so you don't have to do anything at all. Everything, part of how I look at the industry or learning a skill set is I want to learn the rules first, and then figure out when can I break these rules.
Yeah.
So it's an intentional breaking of a rule. It's not I'm just going to break this rule because I don't think it makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if that's your gig, go for it.
Yeah.
Right? But
Headroom.
in general, so headroom is that kind of leads back to the same grid. The third grid. You want their eyes typically on one of that line, the
Yeah.
top third,
Yeah.
right? Either on it or slightly below or slightly above, right? But close to that line. That's where you want the eye line to be, typically. Headroom gets weird if the head is cutting off. Then why?
Yeah. Again,
Right?
it just feels uncomfortable, right?
Especially if there's space within the frame that you could just tilt the camera up and have the whole head.
Yeah.
If you're doing such a tight shot, because that's also a look where you're really zoomed in on their eyes or their eyes and their mouth, that's a creative look. then obviously the forehead can be cut off because the subject in that frame is the eyes, right, or the mouth. So in those cases, you can't like cut off the top of the head. But if you're cutting off the top of the head and there's so much lower body, I'm like, why? You get me? So again, everything can have an intention.